So hello, welcome. Thanks for coming out tonight and braving the bitter cold. I'm actually glad to be here. I'm keeping it kind of cold in my house right now, so it's nice to be warm. I feel like it's too early for heat to be that high right now. It should be 80 degrees out right now. My name is Carrie Gilchrist. I'm the Senior Financial Aid Outreach Advisor at Oakland University, and that whole big long title means that I get to do this all the time. I travel around and talk to students and parents about financial aid and college readiness, so I'm excited to be here with you tonight. Even though I work for Oakland University, this is not an Oakland University presentation. So I can certainly answer questions about OU if you have them, but this information that I'm going to share tonight is really meant to be able to be used at any school that your student chooses to attend. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the elements of financial aid, kind of what's included in that umbrella term. We're also going to talk about the free application for federal student aid, also known as the FAFSA. How many of you have heard of the FAFSA before? Excellent, lots of hands. How many of you are afraid of the FAFSA? I always ask that question because there's always a handful. I like to say that by the time your student graduates from college, you will be totally comfortable with the application and won't have any fears about it at all, right? Just in time. We'll also talk a little bit about the College Scholarship Service, the CSS profile, and the differences between the two applications and what they're used for. We'll talk a little bit about the recommended financial aid sources and special circumstances that could exist in your household after you file the FAFSA or while your student is in college. And then, of course, we'll talk about some next steps so you can jump into this exciting time with both feet. And at the end of the presentation, I'll take general questions from the audience and make sure that you're leaving with all of your questions answered. So without further ado, most people consider financial aid to be scholarships and grants, and that's it. And there are actually 4 types of financial aid. It does include scholarships and grants, of course, but it also includes student employment and student loans as well. Those 4 types of financial aid are broken down a little bit further into 3 different categories. There's merit-based aid, and those include scholarships. And those are awarded on a student's academic accomplishments, so things like their ACT score and their GPA. There's also need-based aid, which includes grants, work-study, and subsidized loans. And that's awarded based on a student's financial need, which is determined by the FAFSA. And then there's also non-need-based aid, and that includes unsubsidized student loans as well as Parent Plus loans. And further into the presentation, we'll get into what each of those things are. Conveniently, those 4 types of financial aid come from 4 different resources. The federal and state governments provide financial aid to students, as do the colleges and universities they attend. And then there are private resources, things like foundations, organizations, employers, companies, and private individuals that provide scholarships to students. For those of you that are not familiar with the FAFSA, it's a standardized form that collects information about a student and their household, and it's used to apply for financial aid at institutions all across the country. It is used to award federal and state aid at the very least. Most schools will also use it to award institutional aid. So it's a pretty big application. There are 2 different types of students that file a FAFSA. The first is a dependent student. Most students in high school are considered dependent students. That means that they enter their information as well as their parents' information onto the FAFSA. There are also independent students, and independent students are 24 years or older, married, they have a child, a veteran of the armed forces, they're an orphan or ward of the court, they sometimes will have a legal guardian, or they're an emancipated minor, or in some cases they're at risk for homelessness during a certain time frame. Most of the students in high school that are going to be considered independent students are those who have legal guardians and those that are at risk for homelessness. Those students are only going to enter their own information on the FAFSA. Nobody else's information gets included unless they're married. Then they would include their spouse's information on the application. The FAFSA collects demographic information, taxed and untaxed income information, and sometimes, but not always, asset information. And the asset information that's collected is only if the family's assets exceed a certain threshold. So after you finish entering your taxed and untaxed income information, the FAFSA does a quick calculation behind the scenes and asks you the question, does the net worth of your assets exceed this amount? And they give you an asset threshold that's unique to your family to determine if you need to include asset information or not. If you do, you answer the questions and move on with the application. If you don't, you say no and move on with the application. So that is some of the information that's collected, and not too many families have to include asset information on their application. I do want to mention that the FAFSA stands for the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. If you were to Google the word FAFSA, the first web result that comes up is FAFSA.com. And FAFSA.com actually charges you $80 to fill out the FAFSA, which is free. So don't be fooled. It's no easier than actually filling out the actual FAFSA. They actually ask you the same questions that are on the FAFSA. They just put your answers into a database and then use the database to fill out the FAFSA for you. So really, you're not really saving yourself any money. You're paying $80 for them to transfer that information over to the application. The proper website to file the FAFSA at is FAFSA.gov, and that's where you will pay nothing to fill out that application. Both the student and the parent must obtain a PIN in order to sign the FAFSA electronically. So if you yourself are a college student, if you have an older student that's already in college and so you already have a PIN, then you're going to use that same PIN to sign your high school student's FAFSA when the time comes. Now, if you've forgotten your PIN, you know you have one, but you've forgotten it, you can get that same PIN, a duplicate of it, at pin.ed.gov. If you don't yet have a PIN, or if your student also needs a PIN, you can go to that same website, pin.ed.gov, and pick out a PIN for yourself and for your student. The FAFSA can be filed electronically or by paper. We recommend that you file it electronically for a few different reasons, but primarily because it's faster. So if you file a paper application, it takes 3 business days to actually get down to the Department of Education, and then it takes them 6 to 8 weeks to process that paper application. All they do is put that information online and send it electronically to the colleges that you listed on that application. If you file the FAFSA electronically initially, it just takes them 3 to 5 business days to process it. So you're saving yourself a good 5 to 7 weeks in there. If you're concerned about putting your information online, the website is a secure federal website. The process by which they transfer it to the schools is also secure. And then, of course, the schools have their own safety measures to make sure that your information is kept private. One of my favorite things about the FAFSA, and I know it's weird that I have a favorite thing about the FAFSA, it's okay. My favorite thing is a new tool that they started using a couple of years ago. It's called the Data Retrieval Tool. And it allows you the ability to link up to the IRS tax return and upload your tax information that's pertinent to the application right onto the FAFSA. And so that's a really great thing for a lot of families, especially if you're not very familiar with your tax information. Then it will just allow you to kind of get through that spot quickly rather than picking through your different tax forms. There's also skip logic. So if you were one of the folks that raised your hand that you were afraid of the FAFSA, maybe it's because you've experienced the FAFSA before and it was a really long and boring application, not so much fun and really not relevant to your household. They've helped that a lot with skip logic. When you answer a question on the FAFSA, they go through the application, and if there's a question that no longer applies to you or your family, they remove that question entirely, so you never even see it. So the result is that it's much shorter, much faster to complete, and it's a lot more relevant to your household. I don't know that I would describe it as a fun process yet, but it's getting there. There's also more detailed help and instructions. So if you are filling out the FAFSA with manual tax information, for example, then you're able to go onto each question, click in the answer box, and it will tell you the definition of what it's looking for and exactly what line number to find it on your tax returns, for example. And so, for example, if you file a 1040A, then it will say your adjusted gross income comes from line 37. And so you find line 37 and just plug that information into the FAFSA. It makes it a lot easier, even if you're filling that question out manually. The FAFSA should initially be completed as soon after January 1st as possible, starting in the student's senior year of high school, and then every year thereafter in the same time frame. So New Year's Eve, you're going to have a fantastic date night. You're going to go out, you're going to have some champagne, kiss somebody at midnight, and then hop on the computer and fill out that application. Doesn't that sound great? The time that you're filling out the FAFSA in January, you probably don't have your taxes done yet for that previous year. You probably don't even have your W-2s yet, and that's okay. What we encourage you to do, and kind of what schools expect, is that you're filling out that information with an estimated amount. So you're using previous year's tax returns, for example. You may be using a most recent pay stub. And that's fantastic, because part of the reason we tell students to fill it out so early, even though they're not going to attend college for another 9 months, is because some of the aid that they're offered is given on a first-come, first-served basis. And so the earlier they fill out their FAFSA, the bigger and better their financial aid package can be. There's a couple of deadlines that I want you to keep in mind when you're thinking of the FAFSA. The first, of course, is January 1st. At midnight on January 1st is when that FAFSA becomes available for the next school year. The second deadline that I want you to keep in mind is March 1st. And your student should be filling out the FAFSA no later than March 1st each year. And the reason for that is because the state deadline to be eligible for state aid is March 1st. Now, if your student wakes up on March 2nd, totally in a cold sweat because they've forgotten to submit their FAFSA, that's okay. They can still submit it. They're just not going to be eligible for that state aid. So they would still be eligible for federal aid, institutional, and private aid. They just wouldn't be eligible for state aid. There are two things that happen when you submit the FAFSA. The first is that an expected family contribution is calculated for the student. And by definition, the EFC represents what the federal government thinks you can contribute towards your student's educational cost. Now, I will be the first to tell you that is not always the most reasonable number. It may not be something that strikes you as being completely available at that time in liquid cash to be able to plump down on a desk at the college and pay that tuition for that semester. And that's okay, because colleges don't expect that. It actually is not a very helpful number for you, and it doesn't really mean much to you. What it does is it helps the colleges determine what type of financial aid a student is eligible for. So there are three calculations that are used to determine the EFC, and I just want you to have kind of a general knowledge of it so that you're comfortable with the lingo and more familiar about kind of what's going on with the application. There's a regular, a simplified, and an auto zero. The regular calculation includes the family's income, as well as the assets. If the net worth of the assets exceed that threshold amount, they're going to include both of those pieces of information in determining that EFC. The second calculation is a simplified, and I know it doesn't look so simple, it's way longer than the regular calculation, but it really is much simpler because assets are not considered in this calculation. If a parent's AGI is $49,999 or less, and the parents were able to file a 1040A or a 1040EZ, or someone in the household received federal benefits, then that student is going to be put into the simplified calculation. The last calculation is an auto zero, and that means that the student's EFC is automatically going to be calculated as zero. And that it happens if a parent's AGI is $24,000 or less, and if they were able to file a 1040A or EZ, or someone in the household received a federal benefit. So in those last two calculations, as long as the parents meet two of those three criteria, then that student will receive that particular calculation, and assets will be excluded from that application. The second thing that happens is the student aid report is developed for the student, and that lists all of the questions and answers on the FAFSA. That is a very helpful tool for you because you want to be able to review that information to make sure that what you intended to communicate is actually what you communicated. There have been a number of times over the years where students will come into my office and they're all in a panic because this year's financial aid is much different than a previous year's. And so we'll sit down and we'll look at their application, and lo and behold, I'll say to them, did you make $40,000 last year personally as a student? And they say, oh my gosh, no, I made $4,000. They've accidentally added a couple of extra zeros onto their income, and we found the culprit. So it's really easy to accidentally punch in a couple of extra numbers or mistype something, and that can change a student's financial aid package significantly. So it's always important to review that information when that student aid report is received. While all that is going on at the Department of Education, there's preparations that colleges and universities are making on their end to prepare for those students' financial aid packages. They're developing what's called their cost of attendance. And the cost of attendance represents to the student the maximum amount of financial aid a student can receive at that school for that particular academic year. So every school is going to have a different cost of attendance. And it's going to be made up of two different numbers. The first is an estimate for direct charges, so things that the school directly charges the students for. These are going to be things like tuition, room and board if the student lives on campus, and then maybe some mandatory fees if the school charges those. There's also going to be included in that number an estimate for indirect expenses, things that a school doesn't charge a student for, but that the student will still have to pay for related to their education. Things like books, room and board off campus or at home, transportation to an off-campus job or back and forth from home to school. They're also going to have to pay for things like those miscellaneous living expenses, cell phone, toothpaste, hair shampoo, that kind of stuff. Things that they'll have to pay for to help them exist in this world and attend college. So those two numbers are added together, and that represents the cost of attendance for that particular school year at that school. This is where that EFC comes in handy. So the cost of attendance is how much financial aid a student can get. The EFC calculation lets a school know what type that financial aid can be. So we subtract the EFC from the cost of attendance, and that tells us the student's financial need. Financial need represents the amount of merit-based and need-based aid we can put in a student's financial aid package. So if you picture financial aid as a big 5-gallon bucket, and there's a fill line on that bucket, that represents the student's financial need. And so we can fill up to that line with scholarships, grants, work study, and subsidized loans. And then the rest of the bucket gets filled up with things like non-need-based aid, so unsubsidized loans and Parent Plus loans. At this point in time, additional information might be necessary from the student. There's a 30% chance that your student will be selected for a process called verification. And that's where the school is required to collect information from you to verify that the information on the FAFSA is accurate. And so they'll ask for things like statements of income, so W-2s, 1099s. They might ask for some worksheets that their school has made up to ask questions about your household or your expenses. They're also going to ask for either you to use that data retrieval tool, which is the best tool to use, or they're going to ask for a copy of your tax return transcripts. So the biggest and best way to get that information down to a minimum is to use that data retrieval tool, because in that process of uploading your tax information, then you're going to be confirming from the IRS that yes, this is what this family has actually filed. And so that takes away some of the paperwork if your student is selected for verification. There might be other requirements a student has to complete. Some schools will ask a student to formally accept or decline their financial aid. They might have scholarship requirements. I worked at a school once where a student, before their scholarship could be applied to their bill, they had to write a thank you note to the donor. So every school is going to vary on types of requirements, but everybody is going to list those requirements in the student's financial aid award letter. So they're either at the end of March, middle to end of March usually in the state of Michigan, they're either going to send you a letter through the postal mail detailing all of this information, or they're going to make it available to the student online through an electronic portal, through email, or something like that. Now, the FAFSA, as I said, is used across the country at every school to award federal and state aid at the very least. Some schools will also use it to award institutional aid. Some schools will use a different application process, usually their own internal process. Some schools use the CSS profile. The CSS profile is used only to award institutional aid at about 400 schools in the United States. 8 of those schools are located in Michigan. The majority of them are private schools. One of them is public. The University of Michigan is the only public that uses that application. But again, it's used to award institutional aid. So if your student is going to one of these schools, then you'll need to fill out the FAFSA and the CSS profile. There's information available on their website, css.collegeboard.org, that will give you some helpful videos, and that's where the application is actually located. There are some differences between the FAFSA and the CSS profile. FAFSA, of course, is free. The CSS profile does cost money to complete, and the fee is determined by the school you're submitting the information to. There are fee waivers available, and that happens after the application is completed. Parents can also create their own private login for the CSS profile, and that allows you to keep your financial information separate from your student. So they're not able to view that information on their login for the CSS profile. The FAFSA does not offer that feature. In a divorced or a separated household, when a student is filling out the FAFSA, they're including the parent's information, and that's going to be the parent with whom they live. If the student lives with both parents equally, down to that half a day in the middle of the middle of the year, then they're going to choose the parent that supports them financially 51% or more. On the CSS profile, both parents' information is going to be included. The type of information between the CSS profile and the FAFSA tends to be the same. The only major difference is that FAFSA will only sometimes require your asset information, whereas the CSS profile will always require that information. There are 3 steps to completing that application. The first is to register at css.collegeboard.org, and you create a profile for yourself and a username and password, that kind of stuff. The second step is actually an optional step. You have the opportunity to complete a pre-application, which is beneficial in the long run because it's going to pull in that information onto the actual application, which is step 3. When you're completing the actual application, there's a time difference between the CSS profile and completing the FAFSA. For most first-timers, it takes about 20 or 30 minutes to complete a FAFSA. For students that are filling out the CSS profile, it can take anywhere from 45 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the time or the amount of information that you have to submit. In terms of recommended resources, the federal government will supply grants and loans to a student, as well as work study. The awards that you see up top there, the Pell Grant, the TEACH, and the SEOG, those are awards that are free for the student. They do not have to repay those awards. So they're fantastic to be able to use to pay for those educational expenses. The federal work study is also free. A student will not have to repay that. However, they do need to get a job on campus in order to utilize those funds. Work study is a program where the federal government will provide money to a school to award to the students that are filling out that FAFSA and display financial need. This is one of those limited fund awards, and they are given on a first-come, first-served basis. So that's one of the reasons why students need to fill out their FAFSA so early. The work study program, when a student is hired onto a department's staff, that department uses the work study fund to pay the student their wages. So a student doesn't have to have work study in order to get a job on campus. It just means that if they get a job, the department will pay them through their own departmental budget rather than through that federal grant. The next awards that you see, the Federal Perkins Loan and the Student Stafford Loans or direct loans, those are awarded to a student in the student's name only. So parents are not co-signers for these loans. So when your student graduates, they get a 6-month grace period. If at the end of that grace period, they choose to not start repaying their loans, the feds are not going to come knocking on your door asking you to pay that. They're going to go knock on your student's door. My goal for your student is that that's not the same door. Sometimes that works out. Sometimes your basement is really attractive to them. There's 2 different kinds of direct loans for students. There's the subsidized loan, which is interest-free while the student is in school, and there's an unsubsidized loan. The unsubsidized loan does accrue interest while the student is in school. However, they're given the option to pay that interest on a quarterly basis. It is a compounding interest, so the interest that they've charged gets added to the amount of the loan, and then they charge interest again. So it can snowball quite a bit over time for students. If they are able to pay that interest on a quarterly basis, it's going to save them some money in the long run. So I always encourage my students to pay that. Finally, you see a Parent Plus loan up there. That is a loan for parents to take in your own name to kind of supplement your student's financial aid package. It is an optional loan. So by virtue of it being on the award notification, that does not mean that you have to take that loan in order to be able to afford to attend that school. We're really trying to offer the student as much financial aid as possible because we don't really know your true financial situation. We know what it was a year ago from the tax information you used on the FAFSA, but we don't really know what it is currently. So it is an optional loan. If you do need it, it's a credit-worthy loan, so you apply for it separately through from the FAFSA. And if you're approved and you want to use it, you absolutely can. If you do not get approved, if you're denied credit for this loan, your student gets an additional amount in an unsubsidized loan in their own name. So financial aid folks really like this loan because getting a federal loan is going to be better for that student before going to a bank or a private lender. Private lender banks and loans always usually have some additional criteria that's thrown in. You know, their interest rate is maybe based on their credit. Not a lot of high school students have credit. So their interest rate is going to be really high. Their repayment terms aren't nearly as friendly. Sometimes they need a co-signer. And so sometimes that is not always a great situation for a student. So we always encourage students to use federal loans before they go for those bank or private lender loans. On the table outside tonight, there's a navy blue and white handout. That is a listing of all the federal programs that we talked about tonight. It has some information about each of the program details. It is a 2014-15 overview, and the awards aren't really going to change. Some of the details might change, but the awards aren't really going to change for next year. For some reason, the Department of Ed doesn't start printing these for next year until like March. So you won't see this information online until later on in the semester next year. The state of Michigan, as I mentioned, also provides financial aid to students. There's one need-based award, which is the reason students have to fill out their FAFSA no later than March 1st, and that is the Michigan Competitive Scholarship. That is also tied to their ACT score, and this year students had to get a 23 or better in order to qualify for that award. The state of Michigan also offers non-need-based awards, and those do require additional applications and have their own deadlines. Some examples of that are the TIP program, the Tuition Incentive Program. There's also the Michigan Indian Tuition Waiver and Children of Veterans Tuition Grants. Those applications and deadlines are available on the state's website, which I'll put up at the end. But there's also some information on the state at a glance paper out in the lobby, and that is purple and teal. So you'll have some details about each of those programs as well. As I mentioned earlier, colleges and universities provide financial aid to students as well. In some cases, they use that CSS profile to award. In some cases, they use the FAFSA. Still, in other cases, they might have their own internal application that they create and use. I do want to mention that the available aid at a school is unique to that school. So if your student chooses to go to Michigan State University and they get the Happy Michigan State Student Award, and they decide half a year in after their first year, this isn't the place for me, I'm going to transfer. They can absolutely transfer, but that Happy Michigan State Student Award is not going with them to their new school. It's a Michigan State Award, so they're not going to pay for the student to go to another institution. And before I get too far, I do have sort of a disclaimer. The Happy Michigan State Student Award doesn't exist. I made it up. Don't go look for it on their website. But in the state of Michigan, transfer students don't get nearly as much financial aid as at the school they end up at than they would if they had started there as freshmen and stayed all 4 years. So transferring isn't necessarily the best financial decision for a student. So a lot of times in high school, students are already considering, I'm going to go here for a couple years and then I'm going to transfer. If they're going to do that, I would recommend that they find some place they're going to be happy with for 4 years, because that's probably going to end up being the best financial decision for them. Now, the question always comes up, what if my student wants to start at a community college? When they finish their 2 years there, won't they be considered a transfer student at their new 4-year institution? Yes, they will. What I would recommend for that student in their kind of initial evaluation of what next step they're going to take is to talk to the 4-year institution that they are eventually planning to attend and ask that institution if they have any consortium agreements with any community colleges. Those community colleges and 4-year institutions often work together so that a student can be a fully admitted student at the 4-year institution as well as the community college. They can attend both institutions at the same time, and they're paying both institutions' tuition cost. So they're paying community college prices when they're attending those classes. They're paying 4-year institution prices when they're attending those classes. But the 4-year institution is handling all the financial aid. So even though they're paying community college prices, they're getting aid as if they're attending a 4-year institution. So it's usually a lot more financial aid for them in paying a lesser cost. The benefit to that academically is that both of their credits at the respective institutions will transfer to the other school automatically. And that means that they're working on their associate's degree and their bachelor's degree with one class. And so that's going to benefit them in terms of paying that tuition, not having to worry if that academic credit will transfer or not, because they're working with academic advisors that are familiar with both institutions, and so they're able to effectively advise them what classes to take. There are also private resources. So, for example, social and religious organizations, employers. They don't even have to be the employers of the student necessarily. It can be the parents or a relative's employer that will give scholarships to dependents, for example. High school guidance counseling offices are also fantastic resources for local scholarships. And the pool of competition for a local scholarship is going to be much smaller than what you would find through a clearinghouse, for example, which often will offer scholarships on a national or international basis. So usually there's a binder, a website, a bulletin board in the counseling office where a student can kind of visit that every couple of weeks and apply for the scholarships that are applicable to them. There are also clearinghouses, and those are great resources for students to find a lot of scholarships. So students go on and create a profile for themselves. They can start in their junior year of high school and continue applying for those scholarships all throughout their time in college. So for 6 or 7 years, they can apply for scholarships constantly. And that's going to be really beneficial to them, especially those that are offered on an international basis, even a national basis, because there are a lot of students applying for that one scholarship. So they have to increase the number of applications in order to increase the probability that they actually get selected for some of those. So I always recommend to my students, I teach a freshman class and I kind of pester them about their scholarships. So I always recommend that they create a weekly goal for themselves. Do 25 applications a week, 10, 15, 20, whatever amount of time you're willing to dedicate to that. Give yourself a monthly goal. I'm going to do 100 applications this month. And consistently complete that goal every month or every week through all 6 or 7 of those years, starting when you're a junior in high school. Over time, that's going to mean that your student is submitting thousands of applications. And so that's going to increase the probability that they actually get selected for some of those. So that's definitely a benefit to the student. Sometimes your circumstances change in your household after you file a FAFSA or while your student is in college. It can be a change in marital status, a change in employment status, increased medical expenses. And these aren't really going to be things that change the information on your FAFSA, but they are things that the school can take into consideration to determine if the student is eligible for any additional or a different kind of aid. And that can be really beneficial to a student to kind of get out of that financial pinch that they're currently experiencing. So some next steps that you can take. So big deep breath. I know that was a lot of information. We're almost done. Both the student and the parent can select a PIN. You can go home in all of your excitement about learning all of this new financial aid information. You can go home and get a PIN tonight. Don't wait until you're filling out the FAFSA. Do it sooner than that. But if it's not tonight, I understand it's, Tuesday, so something good is on television, I'm sure. So it might not be your first priority, but you can do it before you get the FAFSA. If you need a reminder, you still go to that pin.ed.gov website, whether you're getting a new pin or a reminder. Attend events and ask questions. You need to make sure that you are setting your feet on a college campus. Don't rely on our websites and our pretty brochures. We work really hard to make sure that flowers are always blooming, it's sunny, students are studying on the lawn. It is not like that in January. Heck, it's not even like that right now. Students are looking for shortcuts through buildings so that they don't have to be out in the cold. I brought with me as an example tonight Oakland's event calendar. So it's got a big Grizz head on one side, and on the inside are all of the events that Oakland's hosting this year. So there are things like gigantic visitation days where thousands of people come and listen to speakers and take tours and learn all kinds of things about the school. There's smaller, more intimate affairs where you can take a tour and have lunch with a faculty or staff member. Every school is going to have something like this. So make sure that you are setting your feet on the college campus to experience what it really feels like there. And for your students, after they're done taking that tour and you learn all kinds of things that you would never think to ask about, make sure that they find some place on campus, the busiest place, it's usually the student union, and have them sit there by themselves for 15 minutes and just think about how it makes them feel. If it makes them really anxious or uncomfortable, that might not be a good environment for them. If they are totally excited and they cannot wait to go to class and discuss all of those wonderful college things and move on to campus and join all those student organizations and it really energizes them, that sounds like a pretty good place to study. Fit has a lot to do with a student's success in college, and that's really what we want for them, right, is to be academically successful. So if they go someplace where they're energized and they're excited, they're going to be more likely to go to class, participate, become involved, all kinds of good things for them. If they're attending someplace that makes them uncomfortable and they just really don't feel that fit there, they're going to avoid class like the plague, and they're going to try and stay as far away as possible. And so that doesn't help them with their academic success. So encourage them to select someplace that is a good fit for them. You can also, for those of you that raised your hand that you were afraid of the FAFSA, or if maybe I've scared you with this conversation tonight, you can get help filing the FAFSA. Every January and February, Oakland hosts workshops that are open to the public. So you don't have to be applied or admitted to Oakland. You don't have to be interested in Oakland. You don't even have to like Oakland. It helps if you like me because I moderate the workshop, but that's not necessary either. But you can come and get help filling out that FAFSA regardless of where you intend to go to college. So at the bottom of the event poster in the lower left-hand corner, there's a little blurb about financial aid events, and you can register at that website. Registration is currently open for those workshops. They're held at main campus out in Rochester on Fridays and Saturdays, and they're held in our Mount Clemens campus, the Anton Frankel Center, on Monday evenings. So you have a choice of different locations, whatever's most convenient for you. There is also at that website a copy of this presentation in video format. So I will tell you, I wanted to keep it short, so you weren't sitting there forever like staring at a screen, and it's really like boring. There's no jokes or funny things, so it's not nearly as entertaining as tonight was. But the information is there, so if you need it, if you want to get some information again, then you can absolutely go on and watch that. It's on that same website that's on the inside of the event poster. You can also use what's called a FAFSA forecaster. And the FAFSA forecaster is available on FAFSA.gov. And what that does is tell you what your estimated EFC is going to be. So that will help you a lot because, as you know, it's not January yet. You can't fill out the FAFSA for next year yet. And if you have juniors, you're not going to fill it out for another year and a couple of months. But if you can get that information now, that will help you when you use the net price calculators. Net price calculators are a tool that's available on every college's website. And when you plug in some information about your student and that estimated EFC, they're going to give you back an estimated cost of attendance. So they're going to break down for you what they estimate tuition, room and board, transportation, books, living expenses. so you can know how much financial aid your student can get at that school. They will also tell you what type of financial aid a student can get. So you're going to have a really good idea 4 or 5 months early, maybe a year in 4 and 5 months, about what financial aid your student is going to get at a particular school, what might need to come out of pocket, what they have to work for in scholarships. And you can have a really great idea of how much that is going to cost you. And that will help some families kind of narrow down the school choices, even at this point in the year. Apply for private scholarships. I already talked about creating a weekly goal. I had a student last year, her name is Natalie, she was in my class, and she said after the Thanksgiving break, I filled out 15 scholarship applications over the break, and she was so proud of herself. And I said, that's fantastic. How many are you going to fill out next week? And she was like, when can I stop applying for scholarships? And I said, when you have enough money to pay for all 4 years of college, that is when you can stop. And she was a little frustrated by that, but we talked about weekly goals and monthly goals, and she was a little bit better. This is my favorite piece of advice for parents, and if you've ever heard me speak anywhere before, I always say this. Work with your student, not for your student. Please don't fill out that admission application. They want to go to college, their voice needs to be heard on that application. Please don't fill out their roommate profile. That is always a disaster. The same thing goes for the FAFSA. I'm not suggesting you take them on your fantastic FAFSA date night, but when you get home, sit down with them and complete that application. They need to have an understanding of how much all of this costs, where the money is coming from to pay for it, what a FAFSA is, because when they get to college, it's not like high school where you can call their counselors or their teachers and talk about your student. In college, your students are considered adults, which is a scary thing for some parents. But there's actually a federal regulation that says because they're adults, the information about a student is private to that student. And you as a college administrator can't share any information about the student with anyone but the student, which can get really frustrating for parents. So if your student understands these processes and knows what a FAFSA is, when we rely on them to communicate that information to you, it's going to make things much clearer for you. You're going to have a better understanding from your student about what's going on rather than kind of being in the dark because they're familiar with the process at that point. Now, at some point, sophomore year, junior year, senior year, they're going to call you on New Year's Eve and say, Mom and Dad, Happy New Year's. I am so grateful for all the support and love you've given me throughout my time. I love you so much. I am so grateful. And I'm going to fill out my FAFSA tonight. It may not sound exactly like that, but that's kind of what they mean, I hope. My last piece of advice. If your student does not need a loan, please don't let them take out a loan. I'm convinced that college students don't have a really strong grasp of what a loan means for their life after they graduate from college. And I say that as someone who was totally that student. I didn't know how much my college cost. I didn't know about financial aid. My parents took care of all of that for me. I didn't know I had loans until my dad took me out to breakfast one day. It was not a good conversation. It was a really difficult conversation. But I also know that because I had a student come into my office 2 Januaries ago, and he came in and he said, Carrie, I've declined all of my loans for this year. I said, okay, what can I help you with? And he said, well, over the break, my friends and I were talking about spring break, and we're going to go to Panama for spring break, so I need my student loans back. And I went, no, you don't. Listen, you don't take out a loan to go on vacation. You're going to get a job. You got to save your money. If maybe you're going to do a service project while you're there, maybe you do a fundraiser, but you don't want to take out your student loans. You know you have to pay those back, right? Because I always want to check after my own experience. You never know. And he laughed at me and he said, you don't understand. I have a great major. I'm going to be making gobs of money when I graduate, like $30,000 a year. And they really don't like it if you laugh in their face. And I said, if you were to set $30,000 in front of me, I'm going to be so excited. I'm totally going shopping. I'm buying way more purses than I actually need. I'm going to go on trips and vacations, and I might eventually pay a bill, but I'm going to do all the fun stuff first. If you follow that up with, and that's what you have to live on, that pile of money gets a lot smaller very quickly. And it's really hard for students who have just graduated from college and they want to do all the fun stuff. It's really hard for them to do that when they're also trying to pay back loans. So students want to get an apartment. They want to get a house. They want a car. They want to buy real food instead of ramen noodles. They're excited to do all the fun things, but they don't realize that that's going to put them in a tough spot because they also have to pay back loans. So have the conversation with your student about how you're going to pay for college. Please have the conversation about who is paying for college, because that is just as important. Make sure that they understand kind of the general process. We at the college level will try our best to help them understand the details and things like that, but it helps when they have a basis at home for that. If you do need assistance, high school guidance counselors know everything. And if they don't, which is never a situation I've come across, they know exactly the direction to point you in, so utilize them. Financial aid folks, admissions folks, we are really eager to make this a smooth transition for you. So when you're visiting campus, stop by our office, talk to us in an event, call us on the phone. When you see us at Kroger, stop and say hello and ask us a question. It makes us feel famous and we like it. Make sure that you're visiting the federal website and the state website, especially if you think your student is eligible for some of those state awards with their own application. That information is going to be really helpful to you and will really kind of help answer those questions that might come up at a later date. Are there any questions I can answer for you right now? Way in the back. Yes, it's css.collegeboard.org. And I saw a hand down here somewhere. Yes, it's not exactly this presentation of me tonight. It's really like the slides and my voiceover, so it's nowhere near as funny, but the information is there. It's on the event poster that I handed out that's in the lobby. There's a blurb right in the lower left-hand corner with the website on it, /financial services /events or something like that. Oakland.edu/financial events. This presentation is being videotaped and will be on Berkley's website, so you can get the funny version too. It's a good thing they didn't tell me that beforehand. Oh, absolutely, with your kids. Yeah, when you're filling out the FAFSA, both the parent and the student have to be present in order to fill out the FAFSA. Bring your student. Yes. Am I missing anyone? Yes. As far as first-generation college student goes, I haven't seen any scholarships that are geared specifically toward first generation. There may be some, especially if there are foundations or organizations that serve first-year populations. And so I would definitely do like a search on the clearinghouse or something like that, include that in your profile of scholarships you're looking for. All right, well, thank you so much for coming tonight. Have a great rest of your evening and stay warm. Oh, wait.
Really quickly, too, I want you guys to know that the counseling department, we put together a scholarship newsletter that goes out at the beginning of every month, so that should be blasting out. I think it went out to senior parents the first 2 times. We're probably blasting it out to all high school parents, so look for that as well. And it lists some of the websites Carrie mentioned, and it highlights some scholarships and some of the great clearinghouses that are available for students to access. And also on your way in, I know some of you got little halves of blue sheets of paper for an evaluation for tonight, just to let us know how we did and what you think and what we can improve upon. Thank you so much for coming.